When talking about the id, one has to think about the impulse reactions of someone's conscience. It goes back to a guy named Freud, who basically decided that it would be a good thing to call this subconscious part of the brain the id. And what this is your reactions to everything going on around you, to stimulus, to, the environment impacts. Everything just falls on you, and it's what you do in your instinct reaction. There's no thought really that goes into it. It's just your subconscious that reacts. The id is sort of like your defense mechanism against everything that you're taking in, because the id allows you to react the way that any other animal would be. Someone who talks about Freud's discovery of the id is a guy named Mark Solms, and he talks about this in his article called Freud Returns. And what this article is something that just recaps the whole overarching concept of the id. And the quote that I pulled out that I thought was pretty relevant to what we're talking about is stated on page 1, and it says, "At the deep level of mental organization that Freud called the id, the functional anatomy and the chemistry of our brains is not much different from that of our favorite barnyard animals and our household pets." And that just kind of goes to connect everything together back to that animalistic instinct. You just see something and you react to it. There's no really train of thought. There's nothing that you have to think about. It's just all impulse. This all really connects back to the book, because the id is prevalent on page 33 when Papa starts beating Mama out of anger. Jaja says, "There's blood on the floor. I'll get the brush from the bathroom." And then Kimberly narrates, "We cleaned up the trickle of blood, which trailed away as if someone had carried a leaking jar of red watercolor all the way downstairs. Jaja scrubbed while I wiped." And this is just a really graphic image of what the anger built up inside of somebody can do. It's something that, it triggers something inside of someone that causes them to react in a way that they wouldn't react if they had the ability to think about it in a sort of logical sense. So the id just kind of turns us into animals, because if people were able to think about what was really happening, like if Papa was really able to really think and comprehend what was going on in this moment of time, I don't think he would have beat his wife, because it was something that goes against all of the moral values that he puts at a high pedestal in his life. He goes back to talking about Christian and Catholicism and all this other sort of godly traits, but then he goes ahead and he beats his wife, he beats his kids throughout the entire novel. And so when he kills this child that Mama has, it's just a really graphic image of what the id really does to somebody. So when discussing the id, it's all about impulse, it's all about animalistic reactions, and yeah, that's basically the id.
Next up is the superego. This is sort of the opposite of the id, wherein the id is like sort of how you act when you're not thinking, it's impulses. The superego would be things that are instilled in you from your parents, society, things like that, where it's sort of beyond your control. It's not as personal as the id. It's sort of what keeps you from doing things, and a big part of it is the sense of guilt and morality that comes from that. This is seen throughout the book, all sorts of situations, mainly values instilled by Papa on Kimberly, where she thinks this situation or that situation is sinful or wrong, where it's really just a religious thing or something that Papa is way too strict about. So Kimberly's superego is super present throughout the book, where she controls herself even without Papa or some other force controlling her and telling her what to do. A good example of this is on page 175. This scene, aside from the extremely sexual tension with Kimberly being in Father Amadi's car and them being very close together, they're doing a confession, and Kimberly admits that she slept in the same room as my grandfather. He is a heathen. Father turned to me briefly, and before he looked away, I wondered if the lights in his eyes was amusement. Why do you say that? It is a sin. Why is it a sin? I stared at him. I felt that he had missed a line in his script. I don't know. Your father told you that. So, what's happening here is that Kimberly thinks that what she did was wrong. She feels a sense of guilt for something that even a high up in her religion says is not something you should feel bad about. It's not really sinful. So what this is her superego taking control and saying, this is wrong, even though it really isn't anything wrong. Like, whether or not it is bad is beyond the actual situation at hand. She's imposing these feelings upon herself. So the id and the superego sort of coalesce into what we consider the ego, which is the third part of Freud's theory, which will be talked about in the next segment.
So the ego falls in between the id and the superego, in that some conscience is used to make the decision, but it's not an outward conscience so much that you're changing your own beliefs in order to be what other people want you to be. So it's not overly outward, but it's still using your own thoughts and expressions in your own way. So rather than thinking and doing what other people want you to do, of providing some sort of view of yourself to other people that make them think that, hey, something's like they're being exactly what I want them to be, it's more of you're being yourself still, but you're also using your own reasoning in your own way, that you're independent with yourself. An example is if you're, meeting new people, you're being with new friends, and you notice they're acting different from what you may believe. So you don't necessarily act outwardly different than what you think. Like, you don't change how you act to be with them. You still express your own confidence and you're being yourself, but you're not changing yourself to fit in more as superego would be. It's like an outward expression that's not what you are, but it's still providing your own reasoning enough to be independent, rather than just saying, whatever, it doesn't really matter. It connects back to Purple Biscuit in that on page 291, Cambili tells of how her brother quickly acted heroically, stating that when the policeman came, how Jaja did not wait for their questions. He told them that he had used rat poison, that he put it in Papa's tea, and then Jaja was taken away. Even though Jaja didn't commit the crime, it was Mama. He acted heroically, almost taking his mother's blame and instead putting it on himself. He thought quickly in that case. When the policeman came, he turned himself in with not much hesitation. However, it wasn't to prove something. It wasn't to be overly egotistical like superego is. It was more of a level way, level manner that provided some sort of like help to his family. He did it not for himself, but he did it for everyone, which was nice. So.
As opposed to Freudian theory, Jacques Lacan created the Lacanian theories called the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. The first stage, the imaginary stage, it can be called the formation of the ego. At first, when a human is born, it is unaware of itself. It has no cognitive abilities. And the imaginary stage can be called the mirror stage, where basically when a child looks into a mirror and realizes that it that is itself, then that is the imaginary. This imaginary, this mirror stage, is also more than when a human is a child. It can be at any point in their life, or it can be never. Cambili in Purple Hibiscus is a perfect example of a human never realizing that it is. She is always under the influence of Papa. This lack of realization can be found on page 290 in Purple Hibiscus, when Cambili is yelling at Mama for putting it in Papa's tea. She says, "Why did you put it in his tea?" I asked Mama, rising. My voice was loud. I was almost screaming. Why in his tea? She remembers of Papa's tea as being tea of love, how he showed his love towards her, and she never saw that he was always about himself. This lack of realization is a perfect example in Purple Hibiscus of mirror stage, that she never goes through the mirror stage. She never has an ego, never has a superego, because she never went through the first stage of realizing oneself. She was always under control of Papa. The imaginary, the symbolic, and the real can also be called fraud, absence, and impossibility. Imaginary is fraud, where instead of having yourself, you are someone else. When you hit the imaginary stage, you become oneself, you know who you are, you become a person. However, until that stage, you are only fraud. You are only what someone else tells you you are.
The second phase of Lacan's theory, the symbolic, is the most dominant phase of this model. Tamise Van Pelt writes that Lacan's emphasis on it is so strong that it is clearly, like, everybody can see that is the most dominant and largest phase of the model. It's essentially the child moving away from the mother as they learn how to speak and to write and form language on their own, and their shift toward focusing on the father, using them as guidance for law and rules and how they should act throughout their entire life. An example of this in the modern day would be like when kids in pre-K or kindergarten are asked, what do you want to be when you grow up? And their response is, I want to be like my father. I want to do the same thing my father does, and I want to continue that. And this is like the perfect demonstration of this symbolic thing, because their whole world is centered on, look at how great my father is. I want to be that great. That's what I should strive for. And that's the prevalent thinking for most of the child's youth. In Purple Hibiscus, this is seen when the entire family is at church. Cambili says, I would sit with my knees pressed together next to Jaja, trying hard to keep my face blank, to keep the pride from showing, because Papa said modesty was very important. So Cambili is just sees her father as like the epitome of moral good and righteousness, and she wants to preserve that and see it as the best thing. She wants to follow everything her father says to a T because he's so good.
So the real aspect of Lacan's theory is it's essentially the most basic form of thought. It's very biological, uninfluenced by society. It's very similar to the id in concept, in where it is very instinct-driven. The real sense is nearly impossible to achieve once we have all been integrated into society. We are influenced by many things throughout our lives, be it other people or just many other sources of media that we're exposed to, so that some of our more natural thoughts are quite lost. The closest we ever get to it is when we reach times in which language fails. So an example would be like if you're pondering existence. That's a common example of the real aspect. The experience of the sublime is heavily integrated with the real aspect, because it's really just natural. It's uninfluenced by language. It just cannot be described. It's very difficult to explain, as the concept itself is unable to be described with language. It's simply just pure, unadulterated human thought. The real aspect connects to the book Purple Hibiscus, because in one scene where Cambili is picking up the pieces of the painting that her father had torn up, her father starts kicking her. She abandons most of her thought and simply describes the sensation of being kicked, and eventually when she gets hit with a belt, she goes on to just say, the stinging was raw now, even more like bites, because the metal landed on my open skin on my side, my back, my legs, kicking. Perhaps it was a belt now, because the metal buckle seemed too heavy, because I could hear a swoosh in the air. More stings, more slaps. The salty wetness warmed my mouth. I closed my eyes and slipped away and been quiet. And that's on page 211. She just goes on to describe simply the feeling. While she is explaining the pain that she's feeling, she's more so like going into and explaining the experience itself, which is a lot deeper than what she would be describing. And